I'm going to start recording right now. We'll get this up. Share. So, when we talk about different theories in the field of psychology and whatnot, we have to keep in mind psychology as a science's place in history right now. It's a very young science. If we look at it as a formal science, it started around in the 1800s. And so it's a very, very young science. And with that, like most sciences, such as physics, chemistry, in the beginning, there tends to be a whole bunch of theories that try to explain the phenomenons for which that science is trying to study. And then over time, what happens is those theories start to get condensed and refined. Okay. So in physics, for example, in the beginning years of studying physical movement and stuff, there were literally hundreds of different theories of motion and gravity and the like. But over the centuries, that ended up getting refined to one or two theories that now explain momentum, motion, and gravity. Um, and when we look at chemistry, I mean, there used to be, it actually started as a mythology in a sense, in that it was tied with alchemy. And again, there were thousands of different explanations of how chemicals react, why they react, from the gods make the chemicals react that way to physical properties, those kinds of things. And again, over the centuries, we've got refined to the periodic table and better explanations of how chemicals interact with each other. Psychology is kind of in that phase where, again, we have several theories to explain human behavior and mental process. And in many ways, these theories are very valuable in the sense that not all of them can explain everything about the human experience, but each one can explain a part of the human experience. And then where that one stops explanation, other theories can pick up on. Okay. And maybe the first person, and I'm just going to start in here right now, the very first person that we probably should talk about when it comes to theory is the theory of Sigmund Freud. Mainly because he is one of the very first, after the establishment of scientific psychology, to actually introduce a theory of the mind and behavior. It was a very formal theory that he was approaching, uh, and his ideas gave us notions of, for example, when we get to developmental psychology, we'll talk about stage theory, where at different ages we go through different things or different crises. Those kind of ideas came from Sigmund Freud's writings. The other reason we should start with Sigmund Freud is for two really important reasons. One, a lot of what he has written about has permeated our popular culture, which we will get to later in the course when we talk in the personality section. We'll get into his theory even a lot deeper than what we're going to do today. But also, if you are a student who's interested in going into counseling or therapy or the social services, where you will be working with an individual one-on-one, okay, Sigmund Freud is kind of the father of that. He's him with a colleague of his named Dr. Brunner. We're taking these ideas from different famous people, for example, people who put people under hypnosis to help them recover from some disorder and those types of things. And they started to develop this theory of what they called the talking cure. The talking cure then resulted in the movement of counseling and psychotherapy. But the professionalization of it started with Dr. Freud and Dr. Brunner. And they are the ones that really advocated for the notion of what they called the talking cure, where you sit down with someone and help them work through their problems and their symptoms, and that tends to alleviate the symptoms that they were experiencing. Okay, so those are some things that we kind of need to pay homage to Dr. Freud for. But probably what we should do is just kind of start talking about his theory of what we call the unconscious mind. Okay, so for Freud, um, the other thing we should note about his theory, and it's important to state this, is that his theory developed from working with clinical population. Okay, and it's meant to be a theory that covers all human behavior. But it is important to state this from the outset that his theory, it really came from his clinical population, and he did mean it to be very scientific in nature as well. Freud, just a little bit about Sigmund Freud is he was actually studying neuroscience in university. His dissertation was actually on the nervous system of frogs, I believe it was. And he very much wanted to be a serious scientist. He wanted to investigate the nervous system and all that it has to offer and how it promotes human life. But because he was Jewish, he wasn't allowed to be part of the scientific establishment in Europe. At his time, during his time, that just simply was not allowed. And so instead, what he ended up doing is opening a medical practice and becoming an MD, specializing in neurological problems. And so he became a practitioner, but when he started to come up with these ideas of the human mind, he wanted it to be a scientific endeavor. He wanted his theory to be science based. Okay. And at the time of the development of, and in order to for it to be scientific, he looked at the big science movements of his time. And at the time, there was this man publishing this books about the evolution of species, Charles Darwin and evolution theory. And that being kind of at that time the premier scientific explanation for the existence of people and why we do what we do, he wanted to very much base his theory on evolution, on evolutionary principles. Okay, we will see this come out when we get to the human development section with his psychosexual theory of development and how that really plays out throughout our human development physically here. But one of the things that Freud argued based on evolutionary theory is that in order for the human race to exist, in order for us to continue who we are and what we do, we have to have some drive, something that drives humans and keeps our species reproducing and existing. Okay, and he recognized that human beings have two basic natures. Okay, one, he recognized that we're all going to die. And in that process of death, we tend to have an aggressive nature towards one another. He called this the Thanatos drive. Okay. He also knew that one thing that we do as a species is we reproduce. And we raise our children, and then we continue this procreation process through our life cycle. Okay, but those are two very broad concepts. How do you say yes? We're driven towards life and death, And that sounds very philosophical. How can that just be a drive, primitive drive? So he narrowed those two concepts down to the two basic drives which he felt drives human nature, and that is sex and aggression. And he argued that those are the two primary driving forces that drive us to behave in any context in which we are. But he also understood that sex and aggression are very threatening to individuals. Okay, if if we were in a classroom together, I use this example a lot, and it was Sigmund Freud teaching the class, not Dr. Peterson, and he was you were asked, why are we here? Dr. Freud, why are we here? Why are we in this classroom? He would not say something like, well, you're here to get an education, to better yourself, to become a full person. He wouldn't use that terminology. Instead, what Dr. Freud would tell you is he would say, well, let's take the examples of the males in the room. We see that the males are, dressed very decently. Most of them have showered and they smell good, and they have maybe their glasses on, and they look very intelligent taking those notes and the like. And a few of them answer questions to kind of boast on themselves, and because it's not that those males are here to become educated or to become better people. No, they're here to increase the probability of having some sexual interaction with one of the women in the room at a later date. Okay, so that would be Sigmund Freud explanation of our unconscious drives that drive us to do what we do. And he's going to put these drives into a structure. He's going to call it the id. And the id completely exists within our unconscious mind, meaning that we don't have access to it. And the id also releases all of our psychic energy. All of the reasons why we think and we behave come and exist from the id. Okay. But as Freud would explain, if we were just driven by our primary drive, and then again, if the males came into the classroom and all we had were ids, they would be trying to have sex with all the girls while beating up the person next to them. And if you can imagine, in that kind of context, our species would have not survived that long. And so what Sigmund Freud argued is that the id developed what we call the ego, okay? And what the ego is it's kind of like the executive branch of our mind. It has access to the external world, and it has access to all of our unconscious information. And what it's doing is it's trying to find a balance between satisfying the needs of the id while also satisfying the needs of the external world and the social world around us. And so that's the ego. That's a concept of ego. And, we commonly in culture use the term ego to speak to, a person who has a big ego tends to be very out there. If you have a small ego, you tend to be more of a wimpy type of person. And that's not necessarily what Sigmund Freud was getting to. That was a later interpretation of what we call the Neo-Freudians, but we'll get to those folks later in the semester when we talk about personality theory. Now, the other component of our unconscious is something called the superego, okay? And the superego is kind of the counterpart to the id itself. It is what he called the moral component of the unconscious. Now, the superego does not have access to the external world, but what it tries to do is get us to behave in a socially appropriate way. For Freud, morality doesn't mean doing good, reading scripture, and doing what we need to do to be good citizens. No, for Freud, um, um, morality is perfection, meaning that if someone has a huge superego, this is a person who goes into the room, they're always appropriately dressed, they're always keep themselves clean, they always act very appropriate given the situation, and they're kind of more perfectionists. So it's not, if we think of morality as we should here at GCU, don't get the terms that Freud used with what he was trying to espouse to with his theory. He meant perfectionism in the social world, not necessarily doing good. Okay. So now, where Freud's theory comes out, and kind of probably some of the myths that we now encounter with therapy and mental health. Most people today, if someone comes to us with a deepening trouble, depression, or anxiety, we used to say, you know what, we tend to say, no, no, no. I'm not prepared for this. I don't have the training. You really should go see someone. Okay. Um, this comes from that's a Freudian notion, because what Sigmund Freud argued, and if you think about this, this was a really good business plan. He argued that everything that troubles us, from depression to psychosis to anxiety disorders to personality disorders, all of the mental psychological illnesses that we can get, comes from struggles within the id and the unconscious. And whole and behold, who has access to your unconscious? Well, a trained psychoanalyst. It's only someone with training to get to the unconscious mind that you can find relief for your disorder. And of course, who is the person who can train people to access the unconscious mind? Lo and behold, Dr. Sigmund Freud. And that has continued that stereotype that only experts, quote unquote, can help someone if they're having mental health issues. That's kind of one of those issues that Sigmund Freud started, because to be honest with you, most all of us can help someone with a mental illness, and it doesn't always take a professional. But just to put that out there, great business model, kind of misleading. But let's talk about, so that's his theory. So one of our very first theories is unconsciousness, that human beings don't really make conscious decisions about the way we behave and the way we act. It's all driven by these unconscious processes that are boiling up within inside of us. Okay. Now, let's fast forward to today, because there's some issues with Sigmund Freud's theory, in that it's not testable. It's a circular theory. So the scientific evidence for Sigmund Freud's theory, even though he wanted it to be very scientific, it's not a testable theory, because it does a circular argument. Well, why do I do this? Well, it's because of your unconscious. How does the unconscious do this? Well, look at your behavior. And so there's no way to test the theory in and of itself. But what about unconscious processes? Is there stuff that is processed within our mental system that maybe we are not aware of? And when we look at the neurological evidence, the resounding answer is yes. Okay. In fact, what we find is that when we receive sensory information from the external world, it first goes through the limbic system, the emotion areas, the memory area of the body, the fight, flight, preparatory behavior area of the brain. But that area of the brain is not something that is a conscious thing. Consciousness, are what we think as our decision-making ability, happens in the cortical areas of the brain, which we will showcase next week, these different areas. But the casing that goes over the limbic system. That is where conscious processing occurs. But what we have found is that information comes in and we already start processing our emotions and our memories of experiences before we become consciously aware of it, where our body prepares us to behave in a certain way without our conscious will. But of course, what do we do when that information a couple seconds later gets up to we think that we're making the decision to behave a certain way or to have a certain emotion. And a lot of times we will take control of that consciously and take control of that. And sometimes we change our mind, okay? A good example of this is I'm willing to bet everyone in this room, I've never found someone that could be excluded from this event, is I think we have all at least once in our lifetime, if not you will eventually, wanted to slap someone upside the head or just clock someone across the jaw. And I think unfortunately some of us have. But let's go through that process. Someone really assaults you in some way, and you're like, and your hands are tensing, and you're getting ready, and then, and you're just about to, and then you start thinking of the consequences of what's going to happen next. What if I do that? And what do? We then just say, okay. And we end up hopefully not assaulting the person. Okay, what is going on during that process? Well, that preparation to hit that person is the limbic system's reaction to the stimulus that it's receiving. The decision not to is after that information has been processed to the limbic system, it's gone up to the higher conscious areas of the brain, and then we're making the decision not to respond based on our limbic response, okay? Now, there are some people in society that don't have this ability. What happens is it goes to the limbic system, and then it goes up to the prefrontal cortex, and then there's a neural tract that then inhibits, so that we send messages down through our brain that inhibits that emotional response that we're having, okay? And there's clinical populations that don't have this ability, and the one that has been tested the most is psychopathic serial killers. A psychopath, someone who lacks conscientiousness, someone who sees other people as objects rather than other human beings. Serial killers are someone who kills at least 2 to 3 people in 2 separate locations, 2 separate times, with an emotional cooling in between. And they usually tend to be strangers, but have very specific attributes, okay? Tests of these types of individuals, psychopathic serial killers, we find that the neural tract that inhibits limbic responses is non-existent. That they literally have their hardware in their brain has been damaged in some way, that they don't have the ability to inhibit those visceral emotional responses that they're having from their limbic system. Okay, so that's an example of when this system goes wrong. We have clinical populations that definitely fit this bill. Okay, and when we think about those unconscious processes, the limbic system, maybe everyone in the room has heard about the amygdala. Okay, the amygdala is considered in most popular literature the emotional component of the brain. But what it really does is, yes, it does elicit a lot of secondary emotions and the like, but what its primary duty is to alert to threat or non-threat. If you want to think about it, aggression, non-aggression, or what Freud would call aggression. And that's the main purpose of that amygdala. And all that sensory information is processed through that little almond-shaped thing that then says, is this a threat or is it not? Should I respond aggressively or should I not respond aggressively? The other parts of the limbic system also deal with human sexuality and love and romantic love and those kinds of things. So in some ways, Freud, even though he didn't hit everything that probably is processed on an unconscious level, such as memories and those kinds of things, uh, the two things that are primarily processed unconsciously before we have conscious reality of it is things like aggression and sexuality. So when we look at the neurological evidence of the unconscious, we do know that there is unconscious processes that we go through. We will see some other literal ones when we get to the sensation and perceptions section of the class, and we'll look at this in much more detailed later on. But for now, do we have an id, ego, superego? Are we in this classroom just to increase our chances of some sexual encounter? Those parts probably not. No, I'm just going to put it out there. But do we have unconscious processes that drive some of our behavior, or at least prepare us to behave? The evidence is pretty clear that there is. Okay. So what's next in the field of psychology? So if you look at Freud's theory, it starts to sound very much more philosophical. It's a circular, it's a circular argument, and this this bothered a lot of especially American psychologists, especially here in the United States, who felt that psychology was falling away from being a scientific endeavor, and instead it's becoming, again, part of philosophy. And the two people who recognize this the most are John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, who started what we call the behaviorist movement, which lasted here in the United States for a good 60 years. And the predominant one, probably the father of behaviorism, is John Watson, because he wrote what's called the Behavior Manifesto in the 1913s and on. And it basically was a call to psychologists to say, if we're going to be taken seriously as a science, we need to get away from philosophizing, excuse me. And what we need to do is we need to align ourselves with the physical sciences, physics and biology and those things. And what do those sciences study? What makes them what's called hard sciences? Well, it's because they only investigate what can be observed, what they can observe in the physical environment. And so the behaviorists argue we need to stop studying things like memory and emotions and decision making, all of those mental processes that go on, because that's not scientific. But what can we study? Well, we can study stimuluses in the environment and the response of the organism. And well, here it says 40, I think it was more like 60 years. That's pretty much all scientists in the United States did. They would introduce a stimulus in the environment and see what the response of the organism is, and they would set up, this is where we start to get, classical conditioning, which we will talk about, reward and punishment and how it influences behavior and those types of things. And we will see that later in the course, when we get into learning and memory, they do have some operations and stuff like that. But were they effective as a science? Yes. But the problem that behaviorism is that human behavior, they tended to use animal models for much of behaviorism. So they use pigeons and rats and mice and the like, and they tended to get some very strong, consistent results. The problem is that human behavior is much, much more diverse. Okay, we don't all respond the same to the same stimuli. And so there must be something else, which we'll get to here in a minute when we talk about the cognitive movement and the like. Um, and we'll get into this in a little bit deeper mode of thought. But just to kind of give some side notes about behaviorism, some things that they did. John B. Watson was, the father. He did what's called the famous little Albert experiments, where he conditioned a little infant to be scared of white rats by introducing a banging sound while introducing the white rat. We will get to this in the learning section. B.F. Skinner did a lot with reward and punishment, and in fact, he was the first to design a precision guided bomb by using a pigeon who was taught to peck at a certain building on a map, and then when the poor thing was in the bomb and the bomb would release, it would peck at that building, that same image that it saw in the lab, and by that pecking, it would guide the bomb to its target. Unfortunately, in a strange way, the U.S. military thought that was unethical to hurt a bird, even though their bombs were killing thousands of people. But dang it, we shouldn't use a bird as a mechanism of death, I guess. And so they had ethical issues with not killing birds, just people. Anyways, that's a side note. But those are just some examples of some of the things that happened with behaviorism, and we'll get more into it when we get into the learning section. If you notice the two things about that psychodynamic psychoanalysts with Freud and behaviorism with Skinner and Watson, is that our behaviors in both of these camps are very deterministic, okay? The behaviorist would say you do what you do because you had a reward punishment history that molded your behavior into the way you're behaving today. Freud would say your behavior is determined by things you don't have control over, of unconscious processes, and they're very much what we call deterministic theories. And in the 1950s, a group, and we should note that in the 1950s, let me start with this, that the philosophy that was really taking off was existentialism. And just to give a quick kind of summary of existentialism and what it is if we think about the 1950s, we just got through World War I, World War II. We're looking at Korea, and we're seeing things going on in Vietnam, and the world looked pretty discombobulated, okay? And so people really like this idea of existentialism, because what does existentialism say? Existentialism says that we're born basically purposeless in a chaotic world, that really there is no purpose to our existence. We live an existenceless life, that we're born just out of the pure chaos of the universe. And what we do with this is that we develop meaning in life in order to give structure to that chaos. So we develop governments, we develop religions, we develop the family systems in order to give our life meaning. Okay. On the psychological level, two individuals, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, started to develop what is called the humanistic theory, or humanistic approach to understanding behavior. Now, the reason, and this is going to give us one of our first motivational theories, that we do live purposeful lives, that we all are driven internally and individually to become the best version of ourselves, that's really what we do in life. And they did it partly out of disdain for the deterministic models of Sigmund Freud and the behaviorists. Um, I'm going to start with Abraham Maslow. People, if you've ever had, say, an HR training, or if you've taken business classes or something like this, you probably recognize this pyramid thing that he did, and he called it the pyramid of needs. And what he's going to argue is that humans have basic needs that need to be satisfied. And the most basic at the base of the triangle are biological needs. Okay, so food, water, shelter, those types of things. And this is just a quick preview. Again, we'll return to this when we get to personality theory. The second need we need is safety need. We need to feel safe where we're at. The third need, we need to have relationships and love and social relationships. And then the next need, we have to have esteem needs, okay? And at the top of the pyramid, there was this thing he called self-actualization, okay? Um, but what he argued is, and I'll explain self-actualization when I get to Carl Rogers here in just a second, because his definition kind of resonates a little bit more than what Maslow, he kind of left it kind of vague. But all of us are driven to become what Maslow called self-actualization, which for now we can just say is a complete person, okay? But in order to do that, we have to have all of our other basic needs met. So we have to have all of these in line in order to really focus on becoming self-actualized. Maslow would argue that many of you are at that point because let's say you're living on campus, so you have your biological and hopefully your safety needs met. You have the ability to interact with other students and to do self-growth. So all of you have the potential to become this self-actualized person. That's kind of the example of it. Now, I just want to make an aside because I mentioned the business field. For those who are going into social work and counseling and therapy, this model is very much built. This is for example, a HR model. If you want to have a really effective business, you make sure your employees are paid so that they can take care of food and water and their shelter. You make sure that the workplace is safe. You make sure that employees have the ability to interact with other employees. And at the last level, you make sure that you continually to develop them professionally. Your company invests in non-burnout programs. They provide phone numbers if you're having troubles with your family or personally. And so we have found that effective businesses use this model in order to increase the productivity of their employees. I mentioned therapy and counseling. This is the basis of an assessment, right? In order for someone to really resolve their problems, to make it so they can exist in the world and really work through the therapeutic process, we assess their biological processes. Do they have illnesses? Are they sick? How do they exercise? Do they get sufficient food? Do they have a place to live that is livable? And then we assess safety. Do they live in a violent home? Do they live in a violent community? Do they have police interaction? Do they have criminal behaviors? Then we look at their family. We see if they have a healthy, intimate relationship. What is their relationship with their family, such as their parents and siblings and extended family? Do they interact or do they isolate themselves? And then we assess esteem needs. So do they have symptoms of depression or anxiety? Do they have self-esteem? And these are all the basis of a psychological assessment that should be done when we see people. So the application is there, and it's used in business and it's used in social work and counseling to really see if a person is getting all of their needs met. Now, I mentioned self-actualization. What is self-actualization? Self-actualization is when a person gets to the point where they accept themselves completely. Carl Rogers talked about what he called the real self and the imagined self. The real self is you and how you behave in the world right now, how you exist. Your imagined self is all of those things you think you ought to be. So I ought to be the A plus student. I ought to be the greatest boyfriend, girlfriend on earth. I ought to own my own house. I ought, all those things. I ought to be, when I'm at karaoke, I need to be singing like Elvis Presley. Those types of things are things that we think we should be, but we're not necessarily it. For Carl Rogers to be a complete person, you need to have your imagined and real self one and the same. That doesn't mean you become the superstar. No, what that means is you take all of your good qualities and accept them completely. But in addition to that, you take all of your bad qualities and realize that those are a part of you and they're a part of who makes you who. That doesn't mean you react on them, but it means um, um, you you accept them, and it's only when you accept them that you can change. I think often when I do this part of this lecture, I think of people who are suffering from addiction. We know that individuals who have an addiction process, all the therapy in the world does not help if the person doesn't think of themselves as having a drinking or drug or alcohol problem. They don't see themselves as an addict. And we see this a lot in the legal system when individuals are forced to go to a rehab or an addiction counseling place, that all of the therapy we can give in the world until they come to accept their addiction, all the help does nothing. It's almost a waste of taxpayers' resources. Um, but this is the example of becoming a complete person. You accept both of those, and it's only when you accept those things that you can then change those qualities that you don't like about yourself. So, what does it mean to be able to accept yourself completely, both your bad qualities and your good qualities? Well, that means that if you accept yourself completely and totally, you're able to accept other people completely and totally without bias, without prejudice, without, because you understand that there's things about you that are not always positive, and therefore other people have that same struggle. Okay, so if you think about a person who is self-actualized, this is a person who is able to work with the evils of the world, such as trying to help people who are pedophiles, for example, where most people would go, I would just take them to a wall and I'd shoot them in the head because of what they did. This individual would be saying, okay, wait a minute, they're still a human being. Pedophilia is part of them. That's the bad part of them, but they're still a human being and they still have these other qualities that maybe if we work with them, we can then squash or inhibit those other not so good qualities of that individual. Because why? They're able to accept that of that individual. If we look about the history, we could think of people like Martin Luther King, Jesus Christ. Is probably one of the better examples that we can have of someone who accepted people completely. And when we look at the life of Jesus, he didn't spend his life with the clergy. He didn't spend his life with scholars or wealthy, or no, he spent his life with those of what they would consider the low ranks, the prostitutes, the working class, the criminal behaviors, the criminal minded. Um, and that's where he did his work. Those were the people he focused on. Why? Because he knew that those people struggle, that they have qualities about them that make them do things that they probably don't want to, but he also saw them as human beings, as people that need to be loved. Okay, so that's another good example of someone who is completely self-actualized, at least when we look at it from humanistic terminology. And what do we find as far as, Carl Rogers' idea of the real and imagined self? Well, it's kind of interesting because when we look at people, for example, with anxiety and depression disorders and even things like ADHD and even post-traumatic stress disorders, we find that the more dispersion between the real self and the imagined self, the more dysfunction, the more symptoms we see in the individual. So if we take anxiety, for example, and we say, tell me about who you are and what you think you should be, the bigger difference between those two, the higher amount of anxiety symptoms we see. And as the therapists work with that individual and lessen the distance between the real and the imagined self, we see things like anxiety symptomology go down instead of up. So there is something to be said, at least from the clinical literature, about this idea of real and imagined self and becoming a complete person. All right, the humanistic movement is kind of the precursor to something we'll be talking about in this course that started in 1999 called the positive psychology movement. For the majority of psychology, we looked at what is people's worst nature, psychological disorders, those kinds of things, and we tended to focus on the negative aspects of life. And the forerunners of the start of this was a humanistic movement saying, hey, we are driven to something. We have motivation to be human and to be in the world. And what positive psychology said in 1999 is saying, if we're really going to understand human behavior and mental processes in human life, we can't just focus on what's wrong with people. We also need to focus on what goes right with people. So since 1999, the positive psychology movement has focused on things. What makes a person happy? What makes a person content? Why are there some people who are high motivators and really go at it and make life happen, while there's others who are more on the average? Okay. And so this is a precursor of the positive psychology movement, which we will get to when we get to emotions and motivation, and we'll pick up with this and talk more about positive psychology. Okay. Before I move on, I'm trying to give a quick overview of these different theories. You can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Is there any questions about these three theories that we've gone over so far? Okay, thank you, Amelia. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move forward. We have about 4 more to go, but they're a little bit easier to explain than these. Um, the next two are more movements than they are set theories. The first one, both of them started in the 1900s and go up to today. One is the social psychology movement, and the other one is developmental psychology, human growth and development movements. Uh, and what were these two trying to get to? Social psychology was developed really as the most optimistic definition of social psychology is it was supposed to be the ultimate social science. It was meant to be the bridge between psychology, which studies the individual, and sociology, which studies groups and group processes, and it's the bridge that meets in between. I have to admit, because I got to be careful with this, I am a bit biased because that's one of my main focus area is social psychology. But social psychology really studies the interaction between the individual and groups. And there's two things that really social psychology has really illuminated about human behavior. and human life. And I think the best way to describe this is to give the analogy of probably one of the most famous social psychology, Philip Zimbardo, which we will talk about him in depth when we get to the social psychology section, when we talk about the Stanford prison studies and good colleague of his who did the Milgram studies, which are pretty infamous. But what did Philip Zimbardo do to try and explain human behavior? Is we, in order to understand behavior, Dr. Zimbardo argued that we have to see the person completely. We need to look at them as if they're on a stage. And yes, you do have the individual actor on the stage, but what else do you have in order to create that theatrical motion, that show? Is you have to have co-actors, you have to have a script, you have to have a setting, you have to have people behind the scenes setting up the stages, and you have to have an audience. And he argues that in order to understand the human condition, the human situation, you have to understand the situation, not just the individual. That you have to understand the environment and how the environment influences behavior. And then you also have to understand how other people influence behavior. And what we do find is that human do behave differently when we're around people than when we're not. Just to give a preview of this situation, many of the social psychology things comes out of their research, and probably the most famous research that shows that we do behave according to the social context is what's called the Solomon-Asch studies. In the Solomon-Asch study, and I'm going to use this because it's a very easy paradigm to explain at this point in the class, is what he did is he had a participant in an experiment, and then he had what's called anywhere from 4 to 7 Confederates. Confederates are people who are working for the experimenter but are acting like they're participants of the research. And what he did is he had these people on a table, and he had these, and basically he had the participant at the end of the table, and he would ask. The simplest example is he would have 2 cards. One card would have 3 different size line on it, and the other card would have a line that matched one of those 3. And he would ask which of these lines matches, the A, B, or C, which one's the same length as the first one. And what he would do is he would start with his Confederates. And what he was interested in is if all the Confederates gave the wrong answer, even if it was blatantly wrong, would the participant give the correct answer, or would they follow along with the group and give the incorrect answer? And what he found, especially when you get beyond about 5 other people in the room making decisions, that despite the answer being completely wrong, about 70% of participants will give the wrong answer as well. And in fact, 35% of them, even when asked, says, well, you guys are all wrong. Here, look, this matches A, it doesn't match B, as you all said. Even at that, 35% of the participants would double down and argue with Ash that the answer that the group gave was the correct answer, and Ash must be playing a trick or something on the group. So this is a very simple example of how others can truly influence individual behavior. And when we get into social psychology, this is a good example of why people get into conspiracy theories and QAnon, why people get into, the political realm that they get into. We will see that a lot of it has to do with these social influences principles, not necessarily a conscious, evenly minded person making appropriate analysis of a situation. It's more of a social processes than it is. And in fact, when you look at, for example, people who believe in the flat earth movement, even though the evidence is very counter to it, when we talk to people who go to these big conferences flat earthers, and we've had people go in and just kind of observe what they talk about in these big conventions they have on flat Earth. One researcher found that during these conferences, they only spend about 5% of the time talking about their theory of flat Earth. They spend 95% of the time socializing with each other, with like minded people, with people who have the same ideas uh, beyond flat Earth. And we find that this movement that we see has less to do with facts about whether the Earth is flat or round, but more have to do with that feeling of belonging, that you belong to something. Um, and we'll get into that more in the semester. But this is where social psychology is filling in some of those gaps of a lot of irrational behaviors we create because of the social situation. But I'll also say when we get to there, there's a lot of good things. There's a reason why we are social beings. Okay. The next movement is the developmental psychology movement, which really grows out of the idea and the understanding that we change over time. That we can't just do an experiment with 20-year-olds and assume that that experiment will have the same results with a group of 50-year-olds, as an example. Okay. Um, and it really grew out of, unfortunately, the human growth and development is our understanding that children are unique. Children, there's a unique period of existence called childhood. If we look pre-industry and pre-industrial revolution, we find that parents had children to create a labor force. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution where people started to make enough money that created leisure time, where moms and dads became more focused on their children and what makes their children unique. And it's when we stopped reproducing to create our labor force for our farm, um, uh, to do that. So this is a fairly new movement in seeing that infants and children are unique. And what we'll see in the developmental section is indeed we do change over time. And the good news is we continue to develop after 18, after you're 20. For those who haven't hit their 30s and 40s, believe it or not, you hear the horror stories, but there's actually some things to look forward to as well. And there's a lot of good things to look forward to, even in old age. Even when it comes to, for example, love and romance, we find that, when are we the most sexually satisfied? Well, for women, it tends to be women in their 60s. When do we tend to be best at human relationships? Well, we look at our 30s and then we look at our 60s again. So there's a lot of good things that happen in adulthood, which is the good news that we'll end the class with. But we do, the developmental psychology literature really focuses on, based on our age, what are our capabilities, what are we going through, and to explain our behaviors. So, and we'll get to that as we move. I've already mentioned this notion of stage theory. Things happen at different stages in life, and we'll look at some different stage theories when we get to that point. All right, two other movements that are really important in the area of psychology. As I mentioned, the dissatisfaction with behaviorism. And so in the 1960s, we start seeing what's called the cognitive revolution, or the cognitive approach, which brings back the mind. And this is a very important movement in that instead of just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, what the cognitive revolution did is it took a lot of the scientific methodology that behaviorists developed and applied it to thought processes, to decision making, to memory systems. And so it still held the scientific rigor, that was kind of lost with not having developed scientific approaches before behaviorism. And again, when we get to memory, when we get to intelligence, when we get to, we'll talk about our cognition, how we make decisions, why we make certain decisions and not others. And we will get into this very deeply. But that's an approach. Again, I'm just bringing this up date-wise. You'll notice 1960s is when this approach really started. So it's a fairly new approach. And again, we're going to talk about the biological approach, which took off with brain imaging science in the 1980s. And I think I've pressed this issue again when we're talking about the biological approach. You'll very seldom see psychological articles that just completely talk about psychological processes. Most of them will include also what probably is going on within the brain or the brain system. And that leads us to kind of the major approach today and how we're going to approach this class. And it's called the biopsychosocial model. So in our topics that we talk about from here on out, we'll look at what's going on inside the mind. What is the processes that we go through? We'll look at the context. We'll look at what impacts a person's behavior. And then we'll look at what's going on biological, what brain mechanisms are occurring, what neurotransmitters, which we'll get to this next week, are going on that interact with all of these elements to create our behavior that we see. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. All right, I'm going to stop really quick and just ask, does anybody have any questions on those last four theoretical approaches? I feel like I'm talking a lot this week. All good, thank you. Okay. All right, so I just want to go over quickly kind of the field as a science, as a practice. What is a psychologist that I've been talking about all this time? And so we're going to give it a little bit of definitions. Psychologists usually have either a master's degree or doctorate degree, and we're primarily trained in methods such as research and scientific methods and knowledge and theories of psychologies. And we either use these to further our understanding through research, or we use these to practice and to help people as one of our main goals. As I mentioned a couple times in this course so far, the major the majority of psychologists, about 52%, according to the American Psychological Association, are either clinical psychologists or counseling psychologists. And these individuals use the theories and methods and knowledge of psychology to help people who are suffering from psychological disorders, abuse, school issues, work issues, and the like. I did want to just make a differentiation between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, okay? A psychologist is someone who is scientifically trained, and they usually either have a PhD, really spelling this poorly, or what we call a PsyD. And I'll just say that a PsyD is P-S-Y-D. A PhD is a scientific degree. A PsyD is focused more on practice of using psychological knowledge. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who also uses the methods of medicine to treat mental disorders, and with things such as psychotherapy, medication, or in some cases, surgery. Okay, so I want to make that differentiation. We have a lot of overlap between these two fields and a lot of collaboration. But when you hear the term psychiatrist, just know that you're going to go see a medical doctor, or whoever's going that mentioned it. That's a medical doctor that then has additional training in mental health and mental disorders. If someone's saying they're going to go see a psychologist, These are people who are trained in research methodology and are using what we know about human behavior and mental processes to assist a person. So I just wanted to make that differentiation. But not all psychologists do therapy. There's several other fields within psychology, and for your assignment, you'll actually go to this website with the American Psychological Association, and you'll see that there's actually 52 different subfields or divisions of psychology. Some of them are listed here, for example, experimental psychologist, social psychologist, cognitive behavioral media, neuroscientists, personality psychologists, and all of them are trying to study one different aspect of human behavior and human existence. Within this, there are ones that tend to just be researchers. So mostly experimental psychologists, we social psychologists, behaviorist psychologists, neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists. These tend to be our researchers, our scientists, okay? But as an example, a lot of political scientists, industrial organizational psychologists, and media psychologists are what we call um, practice or applied psychologists. They use the knowledge of psychology to increase behavior and productivity in the work, for example. My master's degree is actually an industrial organizational psychologist, and we'll get to this in research methods, where I used to go contract with local nonprofits who tended to be struggling. And I would do an analysis of their organization and help them improve their processes. A good colleague of mine works for the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, and as if you've ever visited a casino in Vegas, the environment is perfect to do scientific or psychological resources because everything is controlled. From the temperature to the air breeze to the lighting to everything in a casino is controlled. And one time when I was visiting my good friend at MGM, he was actually doing an experiment because what they noticed is that people tended to spend a lot of time in the hallway leading to the casino there at the MGM Grand. And so his job, what he was doing at that time, is how do we get people to move quicker through that hallway into the casino? And what he was doing at the time is, those build out walls that you see in malls where it says coming soon, um, uh, you know, um, Payless shoes or something like that. And what he did is he was building fake build out walls to see if by narrowing and widening the hallway, if that would move people quicker through the hallway into the casino. Okay. So that's an example of two examples of industrial organizational psychologists. And as I mentioned, most presidents have a political psychologist. Media psychologists tend to work for a lot of media outlets about how to present information in certain ways. So these are example of non-clinical, and part of your assignment, the assignment for this section is to go look at these different divisions, look at what you want to do, and see if that area of psychology, how does that area of psychology inform you about your career choice? And so that's the assignment. I believe is due next Sunday, not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. As far as the job market right at the moment, non-clinical right now, people who are quantitative methods, neuroscience, social personality psychologists, especially after this pandemic, tend to be in high demand. Non-clinical, non-academic. If you want to make bank and be a psychologist, go into IO psychology. Most IO psychologists who graduate from a good program usually are making six figures within a year or two of completing their master's or doctorate work. So that's the highest paid field, and it is in high need right now. As far as the clinical field is concerned, um, uh, uh, it's a very high need field. It's a We probably see all over the news, or there's a lot of individuals who are suffering with mental illness or problems of psychological or behavioral modality. The unfortunate part about it, though, is that it is not a profitable field to be in, and so we don't have sufficient number of organizations to meet the needs of the communities. So the clinical field tends to be very highly competitive, because we do have a lot of individuals who want to go do good in the world, but not necessarily enough organizations that are willing to step forward and help and make that a thing. So, excellent field to be in, high competition because of the lack of organizations. Okay. Some other fields that are related to psychologists, like we mentioned, psychoanalysts, PhDs, MDs that do psychoanalysis, getting into the unconscious mind. Most counselors are individuals who tend to have like a bachelor's in psychology, and then they go to a master's program where they can become a licensed practical counselor, a marriage and family counselor. We have what we're called psychiatric social workers. These are social workers who have a master's degree that focus on clinical and tend to work in hospitals. We have psychiatric nurses. These are registered nurses who get additional training in mental health. And this isn't a thing. I don't know why this is still on here. You can ignore this. And then you have paraprofessionals. These are individuals who work in what we call the human services field, that try to help people with their needs. They tend to work, for example, the largest employer here in Arizona is the Department of Economic. I can't remember the last acronym. The individuals who deal with families and family issues and child abuse and family violence are a good example of individuals who are in the paraprofessional field. Okay. All right. Let's get out of here. Let's see.